And aloha and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Jane Wilberding, and I'm one of the PRN founders, and I'm based in Chicago. The Parking Reform Network is a public benefit nonprofit organization with the goal of educating the public about parking policy and assisting others with parking reform. Our focus will be on the collection and dissemination of supporting materials, creation of networking opportunities like this one, and policy review. If you're a member, thank you for your support, and please make a note if your membership has expired in the last couple months. We'd love to, have you renew. If you're not a member and are interested in supporting us, please join or make a one-time donation. Tony, maybe you can share the link to that. Membership is $25 per year, and all funds go towards educational initiatives, research, and events. And we're always striving to improve upon these events. With your input, we will be sharing a link after this event is over, so you can provide us with some feedback in your opinion about this event and what you'd like to see more of in the future. The goal of this meeting tonight is to highlight one of our members, Kathleen Rooney, Director of Transportation Policy and Programs at the Ulupono Initiative, and the work of her and others to overhaul Hawaii's off-street parking regulations for the first time in 30 years. Kathleen is Ulupono's initiative's lead in transportation-related policy and programs in advancement of cleaner multimodal transportation in Hawaii and reducing car dependency. Her current projects include right-sizing parking policies and helping expand immediate transportation choices and access to those choices. She brings 15 years of national experience in transportation and planning. Combining both to advance community visions and goals in many diverse communities across the nation. Prior to joining the Ulupono team, she served as a project manager of Renaissance Planning in Orlando, Florida, and was a senior manager at ICF International in Washington, D.C. Katie holds a master's in public policy from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree in political science from Tulane University in New Orleans. And before I hand it off to Kathleen, please feel free as we go along to write any questions you may have in the chat. We'll be addressing them after the presentation. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Kathleen.
Thank you. I always get embarrassed when I hear the bio. It's so hard to listen to, but yeah, so we're going to dive into what we've been doing in Hawaii and what's happened. And just a little, I guess, overview. I've got to figure out my slides now, of course, right? Let's see. Oh, it's not moving forward. Okay, there we go. I sort of, at least from like the events that I've been at Parking Reform Network, a lot of it's telling the story and talking about parking in a new way. And so I thought it would be helpful. I guess if it's not, text Jane and tell her that like, she's got to speed up through this part, but a little bit about like how we got to this space and what's happening in Hawaii that sort of grounds our strategy in parking reform. And then because everybody's always interested in off-street parking reform and, given that there's only about 20 places that have really kind of overhauled it in the past few years, how we did it here, and then some key takeaways from that process and from like our overall strategy, because I suspect that many of you are not in this just for one project necessarily or one campaign, but rather it's sort of an overarching space that you're going to be playing in or trying to play in. And so I just want to share some of our experiences. And I think like just to sort of start, when we started down this path, we're a 12-person team. Nobody really knew anything about parking except for me. So, this is like, how do you bring your team along too? And I actually think one of my team members on here, so he could maybe we'll put him on the spot later and have him talk about it, because it was definitely all new to him too. So, but a little bit about Ulupono Initiative, because we are kind of an unusual organization. We are a Hawaii-based impact investment firm, which means we make for-profit and nonprofit investments in the state's long-term self-sufficiency. And we do that in a few sectors: local food, water and waste, renewable energy, and in clean transportation that I lead. And within transportation, that really means reducing fuel imports. And the reason I say we're kind of unusual is because, well, in transportation, we're kind of more like a foundation, but in agriculture, we are more like a traditional impact investment firm. So it kind of changes depending on what sector we're in and what's really needed. And part of why we're a little unusual in that regard is also historically, as an impact investment firm, we'd really started in the EV space, right? I mean, that makes perfect sense. It's a consumer product, it's sort of ripe for investment changes and those types of things. But it turns out that when you start to get into transportation and you realize that EVs can only take you part of the way, you realize you have to start messing with planning and policy and all those types of things. And so my background, from having worked in all different places with all levels of government, I mean, in transportation and planning, I've done green infrastructure, I've done energy policy, a little bit of everything becomes really valuable when you're trying to figure out the best way to sort of unlock system change. And I've also worked both at the national level, like on federal policies, but then also in 10 different states. And once you kind of get past a few states, and you really do get an understanding of what's sort of systemic versus, what's local. And but that still doesn't explain how we got to parking, right? So in Hawaii, you really can't become self-sufficient without tackling ground transportation specifically. I know this is a lot of data, but basically, like many states in the 90s, we made a commitment to come under our 1990 baseline emissions for greenhouse gas emissions. And about 2 or 3 years ago, we actually did that. So we met that commitment, which is great. But what you'll notice in this graphic, right, like it goes up, it comes down, we're looking good, is that ground transportation is hanging out at the exact same spot. And to be honest, this is why I got into transportation 20 years ago, because within the sustainability and environmental conversations, people weren't paying enough attention to this. I don't know what it means. And I said, I've been working in this space for 15 or 20 years and we haven't moved it, but this is pretty common, where transportation is the last sector to really respond to our climate crises. I think the other thing that's sort of important to note is that Hawaii has a pretty significant climate change commitment that not every state has, and it is a driver for a lot of action. I worked in Florida beforehand. For the past 10 years, you've not even been able to mention climate change realistically. So, this is not the same everywhere, but the state has made a carbon net neutral commitment, and all of our counties have made similar types of commitments with different words, basically, which means that there's a lot of policy infrastructure around this kind of change, and working in this space. But so we know we've got to deal with ground transportation, and fuel standards are a federal level. And as I was discussing, we've done a lot in the electrification space and continue to do so. And in fact, Hawaii has one of the highest numbers of EVs on the road in the entire nation. So that work is going to continue, but it's not sufficient. And so you've really got to start dealing with vehicle miles traveled. And this is the past 20, 30 years of, or I guess 20 years, nope, 30, of vehicle miles traveled. And you can see it's been slowly but steadily increasing, some of which is kind of more impressive here because we're an island state. And so, it's not like Kansas City where you can go to the next town over. The next town over is Los Angeles, and it's a 4.5-hour flight away, right? I mean, so the fact that this is happening is sort of worrisome. And the fact that it's continued to project this way into the future is a real problem. We will not be able to make these commitments under these circumstances. Because even if you are a fan of electrification, which I am for the vehicles that have to be on the road, we don't have enough renewable resources to get there. We don't have enough land for grid space to get there. There's just some real challenges going forward. So you have to start addressing like how much people are driving as single occupancy vehicles. However, we are not the government, and I'm not an advocacy organization with lots of members. It's us and me and like 11 other people. But what we have the ability to do is to make investments in different types of things. And so how do we evaluate those? Well, we do it on impact, opportunity, and timeliness. So impact, will this make a difference? Like, do we know this? How do we know this? What kind of impact? Are we going to spend our time on things that sort of are smaller or bigger or, build up? Like, how do we go about that? The next is opportunity. Like, is there space for system change? Is there a space to be catalytic? And can our actions help? And then the last thing is like timeliness. Is it right? It's not just, is there an opportunity, but is opportunity knocking? And do we want to take advantage of it? And in parking, all three of these were true. The first one is impact. So as I've sort of mentioned, Hawaii has these big commitments, and as a result, we have some really solid analytics to back this up. This is how Hawaii within ground transportation meets its Paris Climate Accords commitments, which is not the same as carbon net neutral, but is certainly better than what we have. And you'll notice that, the top one is road pricing, and that's a pretty big chunk. And we are working on that topic too. But the second one is parking. I mean, at 29% across the state and being able to reduce vehicle miles traveled, I mean, you, like we sort of talked about, you really can't ignore it then. So this led us to the parking, excuse me, the parking reform space. But then opportunity and timeliness also matter. I think one of the things about parking is that it's local land use control. And I think a lot of folks in this call probably already know that. But unlike when you build a new rail system or you really try to redirect transportation resources at the state level, you have to then start to deal it with the state and the federal, and there's a lot of other layers of review and a lot more stakeholders. The same is not true for parking at all. Parking is essentially the jurisdiction itself, being able to exercise its local land use. And so you can do that. It's a smaller world and it can be pretty powerful. It's also a very underutilized strategy here in Hawaii. I have lived in a lot of different cities. And I'm just going to use Washington, D.C. as an example. There is almost no part of Washington, D.C. that doesn't have on-street management of parking and off-street. I mean, there really isn't. I mean, maybe on the outskirts towards the district lines. And I think that's true for most fairly expensive real estate markets. You do not just kind of let people park all over. I live 1.5 miles from downtown Honolulu that is arguably more expensive than Washington, D.C. And there is no management of on-street parking at all. There's no time limits, there's no constraints, there's nothing, there's no permits, there's nothing. And I think you'd be really hard pressed to be in LA, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, any of those that are in the same sort of price point of our land values and have that be true. So you could sort of see that there's a real, not only is it a powerful option here, it's potentially even more powerful. And then in timeliness, we have 4 counties. Anybody? Oh,
yeah, just real quick. Is it possible? I've got a few requests to make to put the slideshow. We can see the speaker notes and stuff.
I'm sorry. I thought that we switched it.
No, sorry. I should have told you a little sooner, but
I didn't
interrupt your flow.
Yeah, is that better, everybody? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks so much.
Okay. Okay. So timeliness. I forgot where I was at. No, and if anything else, if I'm too fast, I will try and slow down, no guarantees. Or if I'm not loud enough, which I can't imagine is true, please do let me know. There's stuff basically happening on all 4 counties in Hawaii to varying degrees. Some are, large land use updates. Some of them are smaller plans, really interested in changing some of the parking dynamics, and some of them are enforcement discussions, but there is a lot happening. I think also really promising is that the State Climate Change Commission has identified parking reform as one of its policies and priorities as well. So I started in, I think, 2018, and we started diving in, and there's really 4 components. One is actually just understanding what's happening. We have sometimes a lot of data on parking, but not necessarily the most useful data on parking, and just being able to sort of understand the lay of the land. The next one was changing the conversations around parking and parking trade-offs through strategic communications. I think this is probably a problem everybody has, is that, oh, you can't do X, Y, and Z with parking, or, oh no. And if you go to any sort of planning commission meeting about a new development, this is the thing that brings people out. It's a very emotional topic. So how do you start to change those conversations sort of more broadly? Since we know a lot of folks were working on these topics, how to just have a sort of network of implementation and collaboration. And then the last one, which we still continue to work on, is sort of more localized innovation and adoption through parking districts and parking benefit districts. So now I'm going to kind of walk through a little bit of all of these things that we do kind of simultaneously, and then we'll hang out and talk about Bill 2. So we actually have a lot of parking on Oahu, and Jane, I totally forgot that we updated this slide, but we decided to downgrade our estimates to 3 parking spaces for a variety of reasons, actually, during this week, which is the low end, frankly, but it still equals 5 Waikikis. But when it was 4 spaces, it was 7. So, and Waikiki is probably the strongest economic generator in the entire state. So, you can imagine that this much land is fairly significant, and it's about over 17 square miles. Talking about how parking goes unused. I'm sure a lot of folks also have these where, it's 20 to 45%. I think Kansas City is like 70%, where it's just highly underutilized. So you're building something that people don't even use. We have sort of two ways that we've validated this in Honolulu. One is we have an urban parking master plan from a few years ago that suggested that these were probably, 25 to 30%. But I also went out and did late night, midnight parking counts to find out, particularly on development that had been built in the past 20 years under the current regime, to really understand. And they all came in, they are 30% oversupplied. There was not, it was like, now I think one was 32, one was 31, one was 30, one was 28. Like they are all in that 30% supply. So we are overbuilding here. And we've also done things like the Black Friday parking, where people just go out in our larger group to just take these pictures and sort of show, like, if this is the highest demand of the year, lo and behold, there's still excess capacity. And Ala Moana here is probably the largest shopping center it's an urban shopping center. So it's one of our most popular shopping centers in Honolulu. And so, the fact that they still had spaces is certainly saying something. And then other sorts of things like just developing maps. This is Kailua, probably the closest thing we have to sort of a suburb here, or one of our suburbs. And this is supposed to be sort of like a town center, a walkable town center. And you can see how much parking still is there. And it still dominates this area. And all of these are just short things that we put together in a few hours, maybe more than a few hours, but things that are fairly easy and accessible for folks to do. You don't necessarily need a ton of resources. You just need someone willing to go out and do them. But then we've also done larger scale investments. One is that we actually, that same parking center, shopping center, we did a parking study in that entire neighborhood. So this area is actually one of our most multimodal accessible places from a neighborhood perspective. I think the amount of people who walk is really around 50, walk and bike and take other things around 50%. So it's very urban in this regard. This area though has over 32,000 parking spaces, 17,000 of which are in that one shopping center that is not managed at all. There's no price component around there. There's not even, you don't even have to be a patron of the center to park in those spaces. So, just starting to explore. And what was cool about this study is that they actually did the on-street and off-street. So they actually tested out CORD, which is a curb management. And we've just been using a lot of this information to inform kind of what's happening in other neighborhoods. And they also took the picture on the right, which is the 3rd story floor of the Walmart that's nearby, not even in Ala Moana. This is at 5:30, so prime shopping time, and it's almost entirely empty. Now, this land easily goes for several $1 million. Right. And it's just sitting there empty. This is an entire parking garage. This isn't even the store. So, just trying to start to make those points. Another project we invested in was actually doing focus groups, right? So I think everybody knows it's highly subsidized, but people get very upset when you start messing with it. So how do you tell people, or what makes it worth it to them? Because you're not going to convince them that it's not going to cost more, right? Like that's sort of the idea. If it was free and it's no longer, or if it wasn't managed and now it is, but what makes people think twice? And I wish I could tell you that we had these amazing things that came out of it. And the answer is no, we didn't. But we did have two bright spots. One is that people, particularly here, really didn't feel like there was enough parking management technology. Like they really liked the technology. Anything that facilitated their ability to pay seemed to, potentially increase their willingness to pay. The other piece of it is actually having accurate and realistic local costs. When we use the national numbers, like the $200 it adds to your rent, people didn't believe it. And some of that's here because we're so far away from the mainland and things do cost different amounts here. And some of that is just because they can't envision it being true. And so you kind of have to bridge that gap, which is why then we conducted a study on what the hidden costs were actually here in Hawaii. There's a lot of national, and then a lot of academics have sort of done like city level ones. This is a statewide one, so it's a little unusual, mostly because we wanted to use it over and over again. I've got 4 counties I got to tackle, right? And we've only hit 1 right now. But we did use real costs, but the ones we shared with people were representative, so that we didn't call anybody out for how expensive their parking was explicitly. It was statewide, but by having it at the county level, we got to see some of the differences. We used conservative estimates and tried to validate as much as we could across different types of resources and sources of information, like bid documents and project build assessments. And then also, you can sort of tell people how much a space costs, but what does that mean to them in their real housing situations or in a real commercial situation? So we added that information in. And so you can kind of see, this is a very boring chart, I realize. What's interesting about it is at the low end, our prices are actually pretty mainland level. It's about $5,000 a space. That's actually pretty standard for across the country. On the high end, when you start to talk about commercial spaces, though, you'll notice every single one of ours is over $50,000 when you include the price of land. So these are the ones that you're going to have in the downtown areas. That adds up pretty quickly. And that even, I think, surprised us at some of the prices. But there's a real cost then to those types of things when it's for commercial and it gets embedded in a mixed use building and those types of things. But then you have to take that information and kind of personalize it. So we did 6 profiles, and I'm not going to walk through each individual one, but it covers a bunch of different living situations in Honolulu, and one commercial situation. So families, couples, singles, in town, out of town, all different types. And some of the big things that we noticed is that parking requirements as they were previously conceived are about $180 to $410 per unit, depending on the requirements. For someone who makes about 50% of the average, median income here, that could easily be 37% of a studio apartment rent in urban Honolulu, where you don't actually need a car, particularly if you're just a single person. Some of the for those who were trying to buy, it could easily add 20% or be 20% of the cost of the condo. The average condo here, when this was done, was about $400,000. So $84,000 is a pretty significant amount of money. And that's not to say you wouldn't necessarily pay for a parking space, but it required 2. Would you pay for 2? I mean, I think that's negotiable. And then it's 1 to 2% of gross sales for retail store owners. And if you were a consumer, pretty much 1 week's groceries would be paying for your parking in a given time frame. So, there's real cost to those, particularly in a community that does not have high wages to match the high cost of real estate here. Having lived in both Orlando and Washington, D.C., it used to be true. Unfortunately, Orlando's gotten quite expensive. It was sort of like Washington, D.C. real estate prices with Orlando incomes. That's kind of how to think about it here. So, $84,000, $400 a month, $200 a month are meaningful differences. So when we start to talk about, having fixed a little bit of that, or at least a really solid reform bill that passed, it was signed in December. So we've already started to see some of the effects of it. I think it's important to kind of talk about the process, the components, and then a lot of the things we heard, because that seems to me like if you're moving down this path, that's probably what you want to hear. I do want to shout out to some things in the collaboration in the process. I don't think we did everything perfect, but there are some really strong things that I thought were helpful. One is again, we have a supportive policy and plans network. The city has multiple plans that support, addressing parking reform. The state has them. Lots of things that are saying we need to reduce travel demand, and you can rely on those to help, sort of demonstrate why you need to tackle some of these things. There was also, we were lucky enough to receive a Smart Growth America technical assistance project that was funded through the Environmental Protection Agency to undertake this. And that really provides a lot of the analytical heft behind the proposal as it was presented to the city council. As someone who has done that work in the past, it made me very confident going into this that what they were recommending I felt was really appropriate based on what we knew what was on the ground and for the community at large. It also almost always includes some sort of community engagement. So there were a lot of people who showed up to the workshop. Almost 100 people showed up to a parking workshop, which is pretty high, I'd say. And it included lots of different types of people, from community organizations, all different kinds, not just environmental, but equity, livability. AARP was there. We had a pretty diverse group at the end of the day. The development community, different governmental agencies, not just the planning department, but the transportation guys were there, and the state energy office showed up. So you get that kind of cross agency group was there too. And we are also lucky to be one of the cities in the American Cities Climate Challenge. And so there was a lot of support provided through the National Resources Defense Council and their staff to help continue to move this along. And then just general additional outreach and discussions. And I'm actually going to show you some of the slides that the American Cities Challenge and the city used as a result of that, that helps sort of set the stage. So, talking about mandates and how they hurt our island, making construction more expensive and housing more scarce and lead to more driving. Showing how, 43% of our households here have one car or less. But all of them right now are probably paying for parking they don't need. And that how almost 69% of our households without automobiles are low income. So, if they're in any of these spaces, any of these units that require it, they are paying for something that frankly they don't need and frankly can't afford in a lot of cases. So, I think it's important to frame those things around people. Parking is sort of one of those topics that it's hard to, although people get emotional about it, it's hard to personalize it sometimes in the opposite direction. And I think they did a really good job just showing pictures and talking about it. The bill as a whole sort of does 4 things. And this was a comprehensive parking overhaul, right, of all off-street parking in our land use ordinance. It took the entire section. It simplified the regulations. It pulled pieces that were in other articles and moved them into this so that all the parking information was in one spot. There's fewer permits now, and it consolidated requirements. And I think, as someone who's in public policy and good governance, like that alone is great in my opinion. But then we did a few other things along the way. They reduced and right-sized the parking mandates. There's no minimums in the urban core essentially. And there was reductions, particularly everywhere outside of that. It created flexibility for developments and residents. Developers have a lot more options in how to meet housing needs and other types of development needs. And it allows the residents now to decide how much parking they will need and use. And it's also setting up for the future. There's fewer and more flexible loading zones for both things like Lyft and Uber and deliveries, but then also it just matches the fact that we don't have large trucks here really, right? Like everything comes off of a barge. So they're all in these crates. So you don't need big loading zones because we don't have big trucks as much. But because it had been imported 30 years prior, we had those on the books. Unbundling as a policy mechanism, we tried to get it mandatory. It did not work, but it is an incentive. So for anybody who does have parking requirements or parking mandates on their property, so they're not in this black zone that I'm going to show you, they can actually access no minimums by unbundling all of their parking spaces. And there's just a lot more like shared use and joint use, innovative parking that's allowed. And the area in which that's allowed is sort of more neighborhood level as opposed to 300 feet. So what does that mean in terms of the impact on what we think is going to happen, right? Because it's not there yet. So the black area, which does not look all that big, is the area in which the mandates have been effectively eliminated. And these areas are our rail line when it starts and all of our urban core and our second city, which is where growth has been designated to grow. It doesn't look like much geographically, but it's important to say that that's like 1/3 of our population where they live and 1/3 of our households. So it covers a fairly significant group of people. And then the other thing to note is that the entire island though now has reduced minimums. And then we did some preliminary impact analyses in urban footprint that suggests that for every person that we could get now to live in that area, their vehicle miles traveled by household is 60% less than outside of it. So, for every new development that comes in that wasn't being able to build beforehand, those 3 extra units, those 7 extra units, every single person has a dramatically lowered transportation impact. And we do think that, given the amount of vacant properties that we identified, that there's probably, under 400 properties that have been identified as being sort of more developable now. And it's just shy of 800 acres. So, so there's a lot that can happen as a result of that. So what were some of the things that, I guess to go back one, if 80% agreed on it, what was the 20% that wasn't agreed on, right? So a big part of it is, you're making people's commute's more expensive and they already can't afford it. I'd like to point out this is almost always in the third person. Nobody ever comes up and says it's actually making their commute worse. It's always someone else who has a really long drive and, you know, works 4 jobs, but not them, right? You know, I think it's important to start to talk about it's only future parking, it's only off-street parking, and it does open up new lands. We have a lot of really weird land spaces, which I think is actually pretty common. It just depends on how weird they are and in what ways. But yeah, really just keeping a sort of forward focus that it's not going to necessarily result in a loss to them right now. People don't buy units without parking. I said, well, we can't really test that theory in the current marketplace, right? Like they're not allowed to build it. So how do we know that? You don't really know that. And then in the affordable housing pipeline, though, we can sort of test it. Granted, it's a select group of people and you know, they do make less money than everybody else. So maybe they're willing to make those trade-offs. But we were very lucky that there were buildings coming up without parking in that basically, you know, the waiting list is, you know, miles long already. So it does suggest demand, even if it's not in a pure market environment. So we tried to highlight those. Another one is how can we guarantee that housing affordability benefits will accrue to residents? So just because you reduce construction costs does not mean that anybody's going to pay less, right? And I think this is a real problem. I think this is one thing that is hard to address. Because the affordable housing community isn't necessarily as gung-ho behind parking reform as everybody else is in that space. And I think unbundling could have helped, honestly. Like it adds enough uncertainty to the market about how much people are willing to pay and under what circumstances that it doesn't automatically, when you reduce construction costs, go into like whoever owns the land and the land price increasing as a result, right? But I don't know that. That's just something we battled with because you can't guarantee it. What I can guarantee you is that we aren't building it right now. We can't even find out if that's true or that it wouldn't do anything, right? Because in most, I mean, there's 20 places that have reduced it and very few have done it like jurisdictionally wide. And that's against a backdrop of a rapidly increasing housing costs and a housing affordability problem over the last 20 years where like the sheer numbers just aren't in our favor. So yeah, I think it's a tough conversation. And I think that's there needs to be more bridging, I guess, on this topic. And then we don't have enough transportation choices, so it should be phased, right? Everybody here likes to talk about how rails, you know, whenever it comes, because it keeps on getting pushed back here. But, you know, I think that really ignores the amount of people who are in our other options. Like we have 100,000 daily bus riders. You know, we have all these households that have 1 car or less. Like that system exists. It's here. It's just, it's not as visible and it's not the people who are making policy decisions. So here are my dues. Don't, you know, use right sizing and costly parking mandates language. Anytime you say eliminate or end parking minimums, people think you're taking away their parking, just as a general language we've discovered. Encourage large stakeholder processes. I think the reason we didn't fight over the mandates being eliminated was because there were a lot of community organizations that were on board for this change. It wasn't exclusively a developer-led process. And so you need that to sort of minimize, I think, some of those discussions because they still happen on development projects all the time, but at a policy level, they weren't happening here. You know, grounded in your data and community goals, you know, environment and climate work here because we've made these commitments to a certain degree. But I know they're not going to work everywhere. But what does work a lot of times is cost of living is usually a big one for most, you know, urban areas. But figure out what those nuances are. It's really important, I think, to have a tailored message for what that community wants and how parking is getting in their way. Frame it in terms of the future and the next generation. The more you can not make it about them and more about where we're going, I think it's a little bit easier. People aren't as invested than in the status quo. And do not forget the power of the development community. You know, if they don't want to do it, it's going to be real tough. And we know that it's not always a given that they will. Lots of places are for it, but you will find developers that are not because it's very predictable and they do like predictability. Challenges. I sort of talked a little bit about this. I wish we could have gotten more affordable housing advocates on board. I think that would have really helped in the benefits sharing pieces that were dropped. You know, researchers aren't totally there because there's no metropolitan area whose prices have dropped because of this. But we know we have all these individual examples where prices drop, but it's not enough to change the regional market yet. And that's true. And then I think the affordable housing developers aren't necessarily there because they do benefit sometimes from that additional sort of challenged, although sometimes they are also tortured by it as well. But we didn't really get a lot of those folks on board, and I wish we'd find a way to do that more effectively. Unbundling is a lot to unbundle. Everyone's always like, why isn't it passed? It is hard. When you get into the nitty gritties of unbundling, it is very, very difficult. Our development community was not interested in this solution at all. And it was one of the biggest struggling points. And even though it's been other places and it's been successful, it's the nitty gritties. It's the little details, like what happens, the X, Y, and Z's. And we just had differences of like how it was going to play out. Data isn't important to everyone. I think that's like data does not convince people on a lot of these issues. I needed it as a professional in this space. And I think there's a lot of other people who come to that who are interested in data-driven policymaking, who it's important to, but you have to realize that you can show all the data in the world and people will be predisposed and not listen and not be interested in what you're saying. And that is part of the process. And again, the power of the development community. They usually are the largest, I would say, largest power block in any given local community. They are in your community. Like the large employers may or may not be headquartered there, right? But your developers are there, your real estate agents are there, all of them are localized, and they all give to campaigns. So when you happen to be working for organizations that either don't give it campaigns or are membership organized, but not necessarily big players in that space, you have to recognize there's a power differential and an access differential. And we hit a lot of that in our experience. So what have we got to show for it? So, we've got a lot of good stuff. We continue to tell stories about parking just in the media with different kinds of products. We continue to invest in different types of things. We've been working also with parking reform on parking benefit districts a bit, trying to figure those out a bit more, as well as other types of reports that just end up having parking implications we've discovered. This image is actually from our cost of the vehicle economy study, which was for a different priority, but within it, residential land parking values are huge. So that was kind of a fun bonus we got out of that. And continuing to collaborate with people who are really interested in addressing some of these, the State Climate Change Commission, folks who are doing nonprofits for community revitalization. And we do plan to track the Bill 2 results in about 6 months. There's no good way to do it across the board. In terms of with our planning department's ability to track it sort of live. So we're going to kind of capture it at 6-month points and see what we've discovered, at least so that we can talk about how successful it's been. We already know it's been successful anecdotally. Within 3 weeks of passage, there were already 10 permits that came in with lowered parking requirements right off the bat on every part of the island, both in the zone and outside of the zone. So we know it's working. I think we just want to give it some time to see if we can sit and say something 6 months out about how well it's working and under what circumstances, which if you're a data-driven organization, you care about, not just prospectively, but retrospectively to make sure the work you did have the meaning you thought it was going to have. And so the last takeaways: identify and organize your champions, find your people, invest in data and research that makes a difference. Like recognize that it doesn't matter to everybody, but sometimes key points do matter, and have those. You could certainly do like an island-wide parking study. We did not, because we didn't think it was going to make a difference in people's decision-making. Build momentum. It is incremental. There's a lot of pieces here, and you kind of got to weave them together. And develop the narrative for your community. Hawaii, by virtue of its history and its community and its demographics, is a little bit different at the end of the day. But every community, I've not worked in one community that has ever told me, oh, we're just like everybody else. That never happens. So you have to figure out, how do you unlock that piece? So, and with that, I'm all done.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. I think I speak for everyone in saying we're all giving you a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Since we can't actually do it. Yeah, there you go. I know I have a few questions and there's one in the chat, but please, if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free. I'm gonna do the one in the chat first and then open it up. But from Sihan, what are some of the weird land uses you mentioned unique to Honolulu that affected parking reform?
I don't know if they're weird land uses, in so much as we have very strange parcel sizes. That's probably a better way, like very long parcel sizes. smaller ones that just make more like larger land aggregation difficult in land banking. It's my, so that there's lots of, you just couldn't build on them under the current regime, and now you can. So that's not unusual, particularly in communities that are older. I mean, you don't see it as much in like Phoenix, to be honest, but you do see it in like parts of DC and San Francisco where, I mean, land aggregation is hard for just, general deal making. So.
Yeah, and like older parts of New England too, I think are like that as well.
Yeah.
So Jonathan Wicks asked, what's the expectations for mode change once light rail opens? Is it open yet? Tell us more about light rail.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's hard, I'll be honest, because the ridership projections that they have are about 10 years old now. So, is that still true? And does it still hold? I mean, I believe at one point they were talking about 40,000 people a day, but that was under different population projections. In the last 3 years, our population has stagnated and we're losing people. So does that, I don't know. They also continue to build roads out there. So, they're chipping away at the likelihood of the success behind that investment. It is not open yet. It was supposed to open, I don't know how many years ago, Keith, originally, but it was supposed to open this year, it was supposed to open last year. I think we're now looking at next year for the opening. It is not a given. It's a really gnarly situation. It also like sucks up all the oxygen and all the other things that need to sort of get done. It's also the most expensive rail project in the history of the country. So it's also automated, though. It does not have any conductors. So there's a lot of cool things about it. And it's also really tough. I mean, as I tell people when I meet them and they want to talk about it, right? I am not going to defend this project on its project management outcomes. It's a really tough one. And we're still not sure we're going to be able to build all of it. I mean, we're supposed to, but it's rough. So.
That's great. So before I go into any questions, does anyone from the audience want to unmute and ask anything? Okay, I'll let people think about it. But something I was kind of curious about is, were parking maximums ever part of the conversation or a consideration when you were kind of going through this work? Were they brought up at all? I'd be interested to hear, if anyone gave you any really strong reactions to that idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, this sort of gets back into the technical assistance it's not technically by Smart Growth America, it was the Form-Based Institutes code. And it was explored, people mentioned it. They did a lot of focus groups. I was in one, others were in others and whatnot. And there's a few reasons why we didn't go with it. One is that we have a real technical capacity issue on plans and permit reviews. And so if you do maximums, that's not going towards streamlining and reducing the development review requirements, which I think is a legitimate concern here. We have a real problem keeping plan examiners, hired, working. That's a real challenge. Just generally speaking, we do not have as many people for as large of an island as we are. And that's a challenge. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that when they did some analysis on it, people are building to the requirements. We don't get a lot of overbuilding. And some of that's because it's an expensive market to begin with, right? You do get it in some of the luxury places, that's for sure. It definitely happens, but it's not this like systemic problem. The only area was on commercial, really, where we saw that sort of more habitually, but they were all older. It wasn't happening in the new permits. It was happening on permits from like 15 years ago when they were looking at them. So we were seeing that phase out. So if you talk about like having to have a system that like monitors something that may or may not be a problem. And then the other thing was, I think, is that it doesn't preclude you from doing maximums on specific projects. Like right now, there's one in the Black Zone that's asking for other types of accommodations and waivers. And I can't go tell you in Ala Moana. And as a result of that, they are putting parking maximums in that. So they're still using it on a case-by-case basis, but as a matter of policy, they weren't going to do that. So it's just too hard for them to manage. And the whole point of this was to streamline. There were lots of things that were thrown out because the management of it would have been difficult for them. And I think that's a fair space, like not, you know, Portland, for instance, I think has 100 people in their parking management program, right? We have 3. You know, I like capacity, we have to pay attention to that because the cost of living here makes public sector work like just not as exciting. Like you don't come here for the pay if you're going to go work for the government. So.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. It might be, maybe it's like a stepping stone. So Paul Barter asked, were NIMBYs or NIMBY sentiments a big factor in the debate leading up to these reforms?
No. And I think I was gearing for it, to be honest. We were preparing for it. That's why we wrote some of the articles that we did and pushed out those visuals, was because we were sort of expecting a lot of that. It doesn't happen in land use, at least here it didn't happen in land use ordinance reform. It's too many steps away from your neighborhood for people to get riled up. So yeah, we didn't really have any of that, which I know, because simultaneously there was actually an affordable housing project in that Kailua neighborhood just outside of there. And it was all about the parking. So like at a project level, people bring it up, but at the policy level, I think because we had, you know, people who are known in the community for defending the community on board, right? So some of, you know, it's like the folks that do clean energy promotion and do, you know, Sierra Club, AARP, we had the Youth Climate Commission on board, a lot of the climate advocates. So the people who might have been more likely to come out didn't necessarily, I don't know. I think because we had that community support kind of lined up on the front end, it didn't happen as much. But, you know, that's my hypothesis on it. So.
That's great. Yeah. And I noticed that Donald Choop has shared his screen. Do you want to talk more about what you have up, or?
And one of the people we wrote an article with was Don. He graciously co-authored an article here for us before all of this dove in, actually.
Oh, okay. Okay, so then Regina Crosby asked, San Diego's is eliminating commercial parking requirements. What's your vision for paid street parking in commercial zones without parking requirements?
I mean, I think the curb needs to be managed because I guess it sort of depends on like what happens. You know, if they eliminate it and there's already an excess capacity, it may not make that much of a difference, but presumably at some point it's going to spill over into neighborhoods and then people get cranky. So I also think that like keeping the curb free is just a ridiculous statement. Like it takes money to maintain those curbs and those parking spaces. And at the very least, we should be covering the costs associated with that from users. I think there's a few different ways. I mean, there's not as much research out on this. Like, how do you start tackling that? There's lots on like how to run like an on-street parking program. And there's a lot of stuff on like how to dynamically use curbs. But I don't see a lot of stuff out there that says like, this is how you manage parking for like motion. It's usually like how to run a good solid parking program, right? Which, you know, would lead you to a parking authority, frankly. And those are problematic for a whole host of reasons. But they do run them well. It's just, they don't run it for your community goals. They run it for parking revenues, right? And so, I mean, parking benefit districts are certainly one mechanism. Parking permits, just in general, like starting, and this is the area that we're working in now, which is like, how do you start to convince people that they don't have a right to every parking spot? It's tough, especially here where we have even less than other places. So, yeah, I mean, I think you have to start on it, but like, that's one of our struggles right now. I have 3 people in a parking management. They have an urban parking plan. Not one thing has functionally been implemented that requires staff time. Like they've passed policies to raise the rates, but something where like, if you wanted to do like a permit program or have more meters on the ground, like, you know, or app-based management of none of that. We don't even have Park Mobile here on street, you know, so there's some real limitations, and that's what we're really trying to figure out right now. So if you have any research on how to do that on the on street, I have plenty of off street stuff, but now I need on street. So especially if you can't get a parking benefit district in and nobody wants to do permits. So like, okay, I got to figure out like, how do we change that conversation?
Well, Kathleen,
Hi.
Hi, many thanks for appearing on the mainland to tell us what's happening in Hawaii. Is there any move toward right pricing the curb parking, even with just saying, well, have a policy on what is the right price to charge for curb parking the way they're doing now in many more cities on the mainland?
I mean, there is in the plans, they've been there, they've raised them, but there's not that sort of like management approach or, you know, a plan to like raise them again. So, you know, and then it still depends on right now meters, which we have so much curb space that's unmetered. I mean, I kid you not, there are blocks in Waikiki without meters. Waikiki.
Well, I can remember that from a long time ago.
Yeah.
I think my only claim to fame is I was living in Honolulu when Pearl Harbor was attacked.
That's right. I have read that. So
yeah, my parents took home movies at the time, and one of us was one time when we were at the beach at Waikiki, the parents were filming us, my brother and me, in the water. We were the only people on the beach. It's surprising. And then they swung the camera around from the water to the mountains, and the only thing you could see was the Royal Hawaiian Hotel and 3 or 4 cars parked perpendicular to the beach. that they had no parking problem then.
yes.
But it seems to be that more and more cities are moving towards adjusting prices of curb parking sort of on a policy basis. Is there just no movement towards that in Hawaii?
I think there is. I think it comes down to capacity, and like it just doesn't rise to the top of the issues at hand, right? Like, so the same group that has to do the parking, at least here on Oahu, is also the same group that's taking over ownership, management of the rail next year. And they hired 15 people for that job alone. So I think, you know, some of it's like creating, I think we have to work on creating the conditions where managing the curb is sort of in everybody's interest. And I don't know that we're there yet. There is a bill to sort of set up a residential parking permit system more. But there's a lot of talk about making it free for everybody. The first 4 permits free. So it's not there yet. And I think unlike off street, where there was sort of some momentum and a policy, like a planning process around it, like we're not seeing that around the on street as much. So I think it's, you know, it's definitely one of the challenges. I mean, when we are trying to figure it out, to be honest, like how to make change in that space when, you know, it's not as clear, you know, as it was during the off-street process.
One of the things that has worked, at least in California, for legislation is to say that we will charge the right price for curb parking around rail stations. So the rail interests on your side, and you use them to increase walkability of the neighborhood. So I think that I don't think that rail transit is necessary for charging the right price for curb parking, but it's a good excuse.
Sure.
I think if you hear that we've spent so much money on this rail system, and that we can charge the right price for curb parking around the rail stops.
Yeah, I know it's embedded in the plans themselves, but that's a good point. I will go and talk to him about that. It helps that he's my old boss. So I have a good relationship with the man running the TOD program here. So no, that's a good one. I mean, if anybody else has other suggestions, feel free to send them to me, because we are sort of trying to figure out like, how do you because the on-street only takes care of half of it, right? If you're lucky. You know, we really do need to manage it a bit more, more comprehensively, so.
Great. Thank you for all the insights, Professor Shoup. That was very helpful and great question. I think we do have a couple more here that I'm going to kind of go through. So Allison Keating is curious how the tourist industry does and doesn't affect parking and driving. I know shuttles are common, but I'm sure many rental cars. Was there anything special you needed to consider with that group, or maybe even some mainland concerns were non-existent?
I mean, it really depends on what island you're on, I will say. You know, Waikiki is definitely more structured around not having to have a rental car, but there are a lot, you know, huge swaths of Honolulu that you can take a bus to, but it could be like an hour and a half on the bus, right? Particularly from Waikiki. So people do rent cars, and you know, there's a lot of that, you know, traffic is generated by visitors. I think on average prior to COVID, 10% of our, you know, our population was visitors. So on top of the 1.2 million we would have another 10% on any given day. And depending on which island you're on, I think Kauai, their de facto population was like 25% higher. So, you know, really, really significant. But it does sort of depend on which island. The other neighboring islands are more difficult because they don't have as many people and the densities to support transit. On the North Shore of Kauai, it's a really big challenge. And they're not gonna, they run a shuttle in that area, but people still would much rather drive if they can. They enjoy that space. And so we don't see them in the rural spaces as much. I think I think we could get more and more people doing it if there was, I mean, I think the parking's going to help because now none of the hotels actually are required to have parking. So now you can build a hotel without any of it, and you could cater to that group a lot more effectively. And yeah, I mean, tourism is pretty difficult, but I think that they're a captive market in a lot of ways. Like, right, like most people who come to a place that's like fairly urban and beaches, like they don't really expect to get a rental car a lot of the time. And so you can kind of build off of that if you have the system in place. I don't know if we have the full system in place to maximize that. Like the bus to and from the airport is not great. So then you do shuttle, and then people are like, well, if I'm going to shuttle, why not get a rental car too? You know, that kind of situation. So there's a lot of other things about funding too, like all the rental cars are used to pay for the rental car facilities, and the same doesn't exist for like biking, walking, and getting from the airport and other mechanisms. So.
Oh, Kathy, I had one other suggestion that occurred to me. What they do at Miami Beach, also, of course, a tourist destination.
Yes.
That the meters are charged by license plate. They have license plate recognition cameras.
Yep.
So the residents of Miami Beach, whose vehicles are registered in Miami Beach, pay 75 cents an hour at the meters, but the non-residents pay $4 an hour. The non-residents don't know it. So that they go up to a meter and they type in their license plate, and it says how many hours do you want at $4 an hour. But if you're from Miami Beach, it is 75 cents. So that makes it very appealing to the residents that it's like taxing foreigners living abroad, in Monty Python's idea, or having a tax on vehicle, rental vehicles or hotel tax. It sounds like you're exempting the residents to some extent, but it makes it more popular.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about the technology piece. That is our favorite tax principle here, is soaking the visitors. That is 100%. We already charge a $5 a day rental car charge, and then there's another concessionaire fare of like $5 a day. We have tourist accommodation taxes that are at 17%, I think right now, maybe up to 20. So we definitely are big fans of that particular, but I hadn't heard about the license plate technology. So I will definitely be following up with you on that one, because anything that reduces the requirements on the city side to do things, I think is more promising than not. So yeah. But I hadn't heard that one. So, well, I think it's tough because they're all Hawaii plates. So you've got to get the list from the DOT. So that's where that might get more tricky because some of that is still on paper. So.
Well, it sounds difficult, but it isn't.
No, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
And other cities do it in Europe, and they give a discount for clean cars, for example. If you're electric car, you get a lower rate at the curb. The more you can present as a discount for somebody, the better off you are.
Yes, I 100% agree on. So yeah. No, those are good suggestions. I definitely think we'll have to think about some of the ways to get them on the ground.
Thanks, Don, or thanks, Professor Shoup. Okay, another question, and there's only a few more. Did the variety of built environment within the applicable area affect the types of proposed reforms and messaging? I find it difficult to apply lessons from large cities that are mostly monolithic downtowns to smaller cities which have both a small urban core and outlying car-dependent areas.
So, I mean, at least from my review, and people can certainly tell me I'm wrong. Most of the parking reforms in which like mandates have been done have actually mostly been sort of separated, where they've been like in downtown areas or pieces of jurisdictions. There aren't a ton of jurisdictions that have rolled them back entirely across urban and rural areas. That's not to say it isn't, but like in our particular case, ours covers the entire island. So, there's two systems in play, but it's much more responsive I think there's easy ways to deal with it. You set up areas that the mandates don't deal with it. And then if you feel the need to, you can do them in the larger. I obviously would have tried to push for no mandates across the entire island, but we've had some pretty significant recent fights over parking around monster homes, which is what they're called, which are basically because we don't build enough apartment buildings, people take over single family residences that were pretty vitriolic, where you maybe wouldn't want to take on that fight when you can get the minimums taken out of sort of the low VMT areas and the urban areas. I think you have to think about the context you're working in. Almost every community has some sort of urban core, even if it's a small city urban core. Like, I grew up in Albuquerque. Albuquerque has one. They all have them. So just start there, I would say. If you feel the need to have sort of like a phased perspective. I think the other thing is that like, whatever the current minimums are, they're too high. Whatever they are, they've all been imported. Other people on this call can talk to this. They've all been imported from someplace else and nobody's ever validated them. So, see if you can figure out like, if, that's where the analysis that we did, that everyone was building to the requirements here. So like, you knew that like some people wouldn't have done it. So that was sort of a compelling statement. I think there's ways to work around it. Yeah, we have that problem. Everybody thinks that whatever happens on the mainland isn't applicable to Hawaii, period. Stop, And I would argue culturally, it's a very different place. And historically, it's one of the few places that had its own kingdom. We've got a lot going on in the history here, and that's, not to minimize it. But our problems are shockingly mainland. Our problems are not necessarily Hawaii specific. They are frankly American problems. So, I think of it that way, which is that, you want to put forward solutions that work for that community that aren't ignoring those histories in that context and those dynamics, but they don't have to be the same as every place else. Like you can do versions of it. They're not all the same. That's what we discovered in looking at some of the other ones, right, during this process. So, and I had sort of known that, but when we tried to find out like who else had done county level, it's us in San Francisco. They're really, maybe one other, I think maybe, a lot of them are cities, just cities. So, I think just keep it, use what you can and kind of find the commonalities and don't worry as much about the differences and figure out what the right strategy is.
Yeah, and another question slightly related to that is, here in the many mainland U.S. cities, we are seeing a suburbanization of poverty. Is this also a concern in Honolulu, leading to more complex equity issues with paid parking? Not that subsidized parking is equitable. And that's from Lindsay Bailey, I should say.
That's a tough one because we have areas where you would say are like the most disadvantaged are both urban and exurban on the Waianae coast, and then Kalihi, and then there's other pockets along the way. I have like the list of them actually. But it's not, but those are sort of historical truths. They're not like recent suburbanization changes. So we don't get that as much, or it's not, but we do have the discussion around equity issues and paid parking. That definitely comes up a lot. And I think what we do sort of point out is that the current system is frankly not that equity focused to begin with. You know, it's not guaranteed that people have parking if they have to wait, right? Or I think you have to kind of take it, the off-street parking that did not come up as much, to be honest. So especially when you can sort of point to how much it would reduce someone's housing costs, and if that's the reason they're moving out further, then you can kind of play that against it a little bit more. But again, we had data from Hawaii to show that, you know, and nobody really disputed that information. They might not agree with it and think parking's too important, but like nobody sat here and was like, well, no, clearly that's wrong. We didn't have those kinds of arguments. So, but it definitely comes up, like what, you know, they're gonna have to pay and all these kinds of things. And I think it just depends on the context, because sometimes it's a fair statement, I guess, and but most times it's already pretty inequitable. So.
Great. That is it for the questions in the chat. I will open it up one more time for the group. If anyone wants to ask Kathleen any more questions, or if Professor Shoup has any other insights, we'd love to hear them.
I don't know if it's an insight, but one of the things that works when I'm, you know, talking in another city, I asked, do you want to look more like San Francisco or do you want to look more like Los Angeles? If you're talking in Northern California, there's no question about that. But I think that one of the caustic descriptions I've heard of Honolulu, it looks like Houston with volcanoes. And if you tell people that that this is what we've become, that I think it will draw attention anyway to say, what does the place should it look like?
Hey, Keith, did you catch that? Our communications director, I think, is going to run with that one. He's on right now. He wanted to.
I like that.
I think we're going to have to integrate that one into the situation somehow. So, yeah. Has anybody else hit this on-street problem and come up with something other than parking benefit districts? I'm not asking because I don't think they aren't worthwhile. I'm just sort of curious because we kind of have identified those two, that permit parking and then parking benefit districts is sort of the mechanisms by which anybody deals with these. But I'd be sort of curious if anybody's hit anything else or have come up with anything. I just want to have a larger set of tools, in some ways. Parklets. We do sponsor those too, actually. We have 3 in Kaimu Key right now that are still up, so. But thank you for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, have there been any initiatives with parklets or like slow streets or outdoor dining expansions? Have you guys tried any of those?
Yep, that's what. So, okay, we've hit EVs. The other one was the vehicle economy and BMT policies, parking. And then the third one is actually getting multimodal solutions on the ground. So we have a whole quick build strategy too. We've done, I want to say 3 or 4 curb extension projects with schools and communities in the city and county. They have us slow streets and some more sophisticated quick builds going in. And then we've been supporting Better Block Hawaii with parklets, and they are actually in the process of trying to do another set and really build some capacity around it. So, but yeah, I mean, anything that sort of changes the right of way, we are very interested in. So, and I think actually one of the folks on the call, I think Deanna is actually in one of those projects that we just finished. So. All right.
Yeah.
Any other last ones?
Paul Barter just said encouraging shared parking as an option whenever or if ever parking problems emerge, and encouraging public parking open to public are best practices, I would assume.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think those are two mechanisms. Shared parking was definitely in the off-street update. So the area in which you could apply for it expanded to like a half a mile, I think. I think that's right. And yeah, our public parking, I mean, there are, we have some interesting parking dynamics around public parking. They're not very well maintained. The prices are off, just the general public infrastructure. And I think they've improved some of it, but there's a lot that could be done to sort of make those more viable too. So that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Okay,
I
great.
just wanted to say one thing.
Sure.
It's not a question. It was just that I love your communication and messaging approach. And I know that internally we've been looking at ways to help change the narrative on how we talk about parking, and some of the stuff you said reflects that. I think we were basing it off of the Evan Manville's report. So I just think it sounds great. So, and thanks for the presentation.
No, thank you. I'm glad my comms director got to hear it because he did a lot of it. No, I mean, that's a big part of it. If you aren't the government and you aren't a big, membership organization, like how do you continuously keep that, like make it, I mean, because like the technical isn't in your favor in a lot of ways. It's highly subsidized. People love free parking. I mean, there's stories about parking. I mean, it's culturally. And so you're fighting it sort of in a different way. And I think that that's something that's hard to do. I mean, there's also, and I don't know if other people experience this, there's really not a lot on how to manage the change associated with this. I know that when APA was in San Francisco, like 2 years ago now? Yeah, 2 years ago, like I went, and that was like, I was on the hunt for that question. And there's not a lot out there that says like, how do you help people through this process? Like, so, and so we've been, I mean, I'm not saying we've made up the guidebook. I think a lot of people have worked on this topic, but trying to figure out how to have a compelling message. Like cost of living here is very, very persuasive. And we have a fairly robust transportation network that covers a huge swath of the population. So you can kind of, I don't want to say give up on the people who are further out, but there's a lot of people who are sort of captive for this kind of change. And I don't know if that's true everywhere, but you can kind of play to that. We also spend a lot of time just trying to make people visible who don't drive by themselves. We have a series of interviews coming out with bus riders that just, because they're just, I mean, there's 100,000 people. That's like 20% of our workforce pre-pandemic. And people act like nobody takes the bus here in policy circles. And that's just not like true. But like the management of the change, is tough. And I don't know if I've been a full-blown shopista for 15 years, but I've certainly like drank the Kool-Aid years ago. So I didn't come into this job not already on board with this idea, but I think it's like almost like a person by person thing. We have to show them what we're losing by some of these, like, and it's, it's regulatory reform. So it's kind of a dry topic too. So not a lot of people want to get into it, but you can get environmentalists. I got to tell you, the climate, mimicking what was in accelerating parking reform, environmentalists, it's not hard to convince them. They are kind of already there and ready for it. So, whatever you can get from them as a starting point. But that's why I mentioned like the affordable housing wasn't as strong as I thought it was going to be, or people focused on cost of living and like working population issues, like workforce housing. I couldn't, that one was tough. I would say like, that's probably where we all need to work on it a bit, because that seems like there's no city in America that isn't dealing with cost of living increases, particularly now. So, that narrative, as much as you can chip, I think one of the things we always say is, at least in Hawaii, like we don't know how to build anything for less than $300,000. And that's if the land is free, right? In Hawaii, in Honolulu, at least. We do not have a way of doing this. We also don't seem to be capable of raising the minimum wage or increasing the EITC benefit to give you more money as a lower income worker. But what I can do? If you don't have to have that second car, that third car, that fourth car, in some cases, if you have like 10 people in a house, those other 8 cars, we can give you $15,000 back in your pocket in private costs just right off the bat of what you don't have to pay for. right? We don't have a lot of things that reduce cost of living so completely. And since we have a good multimodal system, it's maybe not as great as it could be all the time, but it's there. I think it's important to kind of, talk about that, like as a cost of living mechanism, like that's significant, under most circumstances, that's a huge amount of money. And it's not saying car free, it's saying car light. Like we have a lot of excess cars here. So, that's sort of like a larger messaging that we do, but we spend a lot of time on that, like how to talk about it. People talk about it as alternatives all the time. Stop talking about transportation alternatives. They are options. They are choices. Even if they are alternatives and only 1% takes them, they are choices. Alternatives means they're never going to be mainstream. And you just don't want to give in on that argument. Keith can laugh about it, but like we had an entire conversation about this yesterday about not writing things from the windshield perspective, just not seeding those types of things. So I'm open to always consult, or I can offer Keith up. He's better than I am at it. So
I think that's so important, having language that actually reflects, like not using the word alternative. It's so important. Okay, we do have a couple more questions if you are willing to entertain them.
Still my work day. You all are the ones on the late time. So
yeah. So Paul Barter said, you mentioned the developer community was divided on this issue. Which elements were for and which against?
They were mostly for the overall, like the 80%. There were pieces that they didn't like to such an extent that they were willing to withdraw their support for the rest of the proposal. And I think that's what was sort of surprising for us. Like you go to any community and talk to developers, this is like usually the top of their list of things they want rolled back. I don't know that the entire development community was as monolithic though as I present them as. Like there were probably lots of them who just didn't really pay attention or didn't really care or just didn't feel like getting invested. Like whatever which way it went, they were still going to go out and make their money and do what they needed to do. So I think the pieces that I would say that were the ones that like people didn't really like were the things that tried to sort of share the community benefits a bit more when you reduce the parking minimums, right? So if you look at this sort of from a regulatory rollback perspective, right, like they're doing all these rollbacks and all these things will ostensibly help the development community reduce costs, and they're going to get more units and more profit, even if the percentages are lower on those units, right? And so the idea would be, so we're doing that, are there things that we can share in all those benefits, not just in the potential for lowered housing costs, because some of that will be captured in profit and arbitrage. And so, that's where the unbundling came in, right? Like the idea would be is that if you did unbundling, that was a way of sharing it, so that as much as the developer gets to choose how much to build, the consumer gets to decide how much to consume. So and then it doesn't automatically increase the prices of the land, which is what a lot of the affordable housing advocates feared was going to happen if you did this. So that was one big chunk. And then the second big chunk that I would say was actually there were a lot of requirements on setbacks to allow for more multimodal, like so more trees, better streetscapes, more pedestrian improvements and sidewalks, and to also mandate putting the parking behind. So like, organizing around street design, site design a little bit more. And those just, there was just nothing there for agreement as kind of the easier way. I think the thing is there were a lot of developers who were already doing it, but then these took it a little bit further and they felt like with some of the smaller sites, it was really tough to pull off. And I think to a certain degree, maybe that's legitimate, but I think a part of me also thinks like, how could the answer be that there's nothing, right? Like that there's nothing, there's no additional setback that would be worthwhile for more trees. Like that just like there was no number that could be created. Or agreed upon, that it was all, and that happened a lot. It was either all or nothing. There wasn't a lot of negotiating space, it felt like, in terms of options. And so that's kind of how I felt. We do have a lot of larger developers here, which I don't know if that's the same everywhere, but and so and they have a fairly organized group too to represent their interests. So I think it's, even if they don't speak for everyone, it feels like they're speaking for everybody. So does that help, Paul? Hopefully.
He said thanks. And then Jonathan Wicks has a question, and I actually have a question to piggyback off of his. Have you heard of any adaptive reuse projects locally converting parking to housing or other? And then my question is about, you mentioned that you've already gotten 10 permits with lowered, parking requirements. I'm wondering if you could speak to, or if you even know off the top of your head, like what those land uses are. And like if you're seeing a pattern of, where they're located, or, are they on, parking lots, or, are they in different areas, like anything interesting about them?
Well, let me take the adaptive reuse. I mean, I know they're out there, but they're not here, right? Like, so I feel like if you went to look for some examples, you'd probably find some along the way. We don't really have that happening here as much. I mean, I think we still have like an inordinate amount of surface lots, to be honest, that like could just be flipped, and that's like the easier stuff. I mean, there was an idea that like as the parking demand was projected to decline, that like you would want more adaptability built in, and that was part of the bill originally, but that didn't last very long. That was another one of those things that like was just basically going to increase costs, and they didn't want to have it in there, so it disappeared. So as for the permits, and we actually, they were all over the island already. That like even so most of them were in the black zone, right, in that map, because that's where you would get most of it. But we actually had some already taking advantage of the reductions in places like Kailua and a little bit out. That had already happened. So, and that's really just anecdotally. Like I haven't looked at the permits or anything like that. That's just sort of verbally I heard from folks at the Department of Planning and Permitting about like how already things have been coming in, and they mentioned it, and that's about all I know at this point in time. I think when 6 months hits, we're probably going to go back and reach out and just see if they, someone can at least send us like some sort of, sampling, so we can kind of go through it and get some of those numbers and document it a bit more. But I don't know. We'll see. It's tough to get that kind of data out of cities and counties in general. They don't have a system set up for it, really. That's part of the challenge, right?
Yeah, it can be really hard to figure out the data on the back end.
Yeah, I mean, we were super lucky that Smart Growth America spent a lot of time doing that. That was one of the things that they really helped with, I think, which was like sort of just inventory everything we did know and what did it mean. And then based, and they did do some additional analytics around multimodal accessibility for those of you that are familiar with their work in that topic. And then also on like vehicle ownership and stuff like that, that was helpful. That was new information too. So that was also really great.
Great. Okay, if no one else has any questions, I think that this is a really great discussion, and thank you so much for taking all the time to talk with us. This was amazing.
No, thank you. It was fun to do. I finally got to pull all my PowerPoints together and see if it worked. So I appreciate it. So no, thank you so much. So.
Well, it works very well. And Tony actually just sent a link, a great reminder to fill out the survey about our events. What you liked, what you don't like, what you'd like to see more of, always very helpful. And again, renew your membership, become a member, donate if you'd like. And thank you again for attending this event, and more to come.
If you aren't, I highly recommend it. It's been really helpful as we delve into on-street stuff.
Have a good night, everyone.